Then Baron Gishi Tanaka, the Prime Minister, carefully set down Japanese aims in a document called the Tanaka Memorial. It was presented to the Emperor July 25th, 1927. Here was their dream: Manchuria for raw materials, China for manpower.
The Tripartite Pact was an alliance formed between Germany, Japan, and Italy. It was signed by Adolf Hitler and delegates from Japan and Italy, and was signed to bring cooperation between the three nations. The pact stated that they would support each other politically, economically, and militarily. Japan wanted to conquer Asia, Germany wanted to conquer Europe, and Italy wanted to conquer North Africa.
In 1931, Japan had begun military operations aimed at seizing Manchuria. In 1932, a puppet state of Manchukuo was declared. The U.S., other great powers, and the League of Nations all protested, but none took any substantive retaliatory measures. Allied resistance to Japanese aggression strengthened in 1936, so Japan decided to strike. They launched a major invasion in July of 1937, sweeping aside nationalist armies and communist guerrilla forces. And by 1938, the Japanese controlled the wealthier portions of China and nearly half its population.
Japan was imperialistic by attacking several Asian and Pacific countries. Japan did all of this to try to conquer Southeast Asia and expand their empire as much as possible. They expanded into other countries even before Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire also attacked several other countries and territories shortly after Pearl Harbor, including the Philippines, British Malaya, and Hong Kong, to try and gain land and resources, but also to weaken their enemies.
Japan's answer to the economic blizzard of the Depression was war. First, an invasion of Manchuria, and then China. Japan had few natural resources and a rapidly increasing population. She determined to take the raw materials and living space that she wanted by force.
In 1942, the Japanese Navy wanted to invade Australia, but the Japanese Army rejected this and instead decided to invade Midway Island. They did this to cut off Australia from the U.S. and to continue expansion through the South Pacific. Japan's plans for world domination hinged on the conquering of China. China had natural resources such as oil and steel. Having mined their island dry, Japan was in need of these materials in order to build the machines a strong army depended on.
Japan's plans backfired on them because it led the United States into the war. Pearl Harbor caused the U.S. to come into World War II and eventually ended in the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This ultimately led to the defeat of Hirohito and his country. Japan's industrial potential was nothing compared to the United States. Because of this, Japan was unable to keep the advantage they had gained by bombing Pearl Harbor.
The United States also strangled Japan's economy through Operation Starvation. This cut off the Japanese supply lines and shipping by laying mines in vital routes. During this period between 1944 and 1945, the United States had defeated the Japanese island.
The United States, United Kingdom, and China issued the Potsdam Declaration that demanded the surrender of Japan, or they would face prompt and utter destruction. It was the ignoring of this declaration that resulted in the atomic bombings and defeat of the Japanese Empire.
One thing Japan needed to conquer the world was a strong army, and to have a strong army, you need many different resources and oil. These things were already used up on the main Japanese islands, and because Japan had little resources, they had to conquer and occupy other countries such as China, Thailand, British Malaya, and the Philippines that had these supplies.
The U.S. Pacific Fleet was very strong and a big threat to Japan, so the Japanese planned to destroy it, or severely damage it, by bombing Pearl Harbor. This also had another benefit because it occupied the U.S. fleet, while Japan attacked and occupied Dutch, U.S., and UK territories in the Pacific. When the U.S. declared war on Japan, the Tripartite Pact made Germany and Italy declare war on the U.S.
Japan knew that they would have to utilize the advantage they gained at Pearl Harbor and issue out a quick string of defeats of the U.S. Pacific Fleet in order to carry out their plans. Then they could capture and strengthen their outermost strategic positions in the Pacific in order to keep the U.S. at bay while they carried out more invasions and operations in Asia.
Other areas Japan occupied were Borneo, Central Java, Malang, Cebu, Sumatra, and Dutch New Guinea. Not all these countries they invaded thought of them as enemies.
The Indonesians thought of the Japanese as liberators from the Dutch. However, the Japanese occupation there forced millions to die from starvation and forced labor. To invade Burma and Malaya, Japan needed to use Thai ports, airfields, and railways.
The Thai army, however, had just beaten the French in the French-Thai War. Their army was strong, and the Japanese would have to face casualties. So the Japanese decided to ally with Thailand and conducted an invasion of Malaya from Thailand. Thailand then committed soldiers to help the Japanese with the invasion of Burma. The war in Asia ended on August 15th, 1945, when Japan agreed to surrender because of the nuclear bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So how's it going, Foreign Minister of Japan?
Good. How are you, Foreign Minister of Italy?
We're doing good. So, should we sign this tripartite pact to ally ourselves together?
Me too.
How's it going, Hitler?
Good. How's Italy doing?
Good. How about Hirohito?
Imperialistic now. It's crazy.
Ever since Japanese troops had overrun Manchuria in 1931 and turned it into the puppet state of Manchu Kuo, there had been concern in the West over Japanese expansionism. This had increased in 1937, when the Japanese launched an all-out assault on China. But the Western powers were not prepared to risk war with Japan. This was even though Western warships like the American gunboat Panay were bombed by Japanese aircraft. Yet Japan did apologize for this act. She did so because she had a major weakness, which the West threatened to exploit. This was a grave lack of natural resources. Japan was heavily reliant on imports of tin, oil, rubber, and other essential raw materials. She therefore dare not provoke the West too much. In the meantime, the Chinese struggle against Japan did have Western moral support. Their leader, Chiang Kai-shek, also began to receive American loans to enable him to purchase modern weapons and equipment. These were delivered via a road that had been recently opened through the mountains separating Burma from China. It became known as the Burma Road. In July 1940, a new and more militant government took over in Japan. This looked to making the country economically independent of the West by carving out an empire in Southeast Asia through removing the British, French, Dutch, and American presence from the mineral-rich territories there. This plan was called the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. In order to counterbalance British and American opposition to her policies, Japan signed a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy in September 1940. Later, in April